tonight. We have a fantastic debate. The resolution tonight is most adults should be able to commit suicide with whatever consenting assistance at any time of their choosing without any legal obstacle or hurdle. For the affirmative, we have our very own Dennis Pratt. Dennis is a graduate of Northwestern and MIT, was a serial entrepreneur.
Say serial killer.
Maybe. Also, Dennis has been a serial liberty entrepreneur in the Free State Project. He has founded the Shell, managed Pork Fest, founded the New Independence Inn, and has been a great benefit to New Hampshire. Also, Liberty Bus Tours, that's true. He also was the #1 writer for Quora, a libertarian writer for Quora. Dexter Tarbox Jr. is a seacoast entrepreneur and political writer back at the Shell taking the conservative position. So please give them a round of applause. Dennis, you go first.
Thank you very much, Scott.
15 minutes.
All right. Good to go?
Yes.
I am a selfish coward. I found this out when I advertised this debate. Now, I do a lot of advertising, and I've never gotten as many feedback comments as I did for this particular debate. Some of the feedback cheered on the affirmative, the side that I'm taking on, but there were more on the negative. And let's just say that they were not particularly diplomatic. You see, I fully plan on taking my life when it is my time. I want that process to be peaceful and painless. I want it to be with my loved ones. I want access to the right mix of solids and gases that ensure a peaceful, painless, not messy, but guaranteed end. And if I need help, I'd like to be able to ask for that help, perhaps from someone who has expertise, but certainly from whomever voluntarily will consent to help. I don't want the kindness of this person to be returned by being treated cruelly by the thugs of the state, whether it's having his stuff stolen or being caged, simply for being kind enough to grant me my dying wish. And all this I want on my time schedule. So yeah, maybe I'm selfish. In short, I want to be the decider of my own death. Because I have this crazy idea, and it's something that affects people who study libertarian ethics, that I and I alone exclusively and fully own my own body. What that means is that nobody has a superior ownership over my body. No psychopathic ruler, no government bureaucrat, no religious preacher, government licensed doctor, or health and wellness committee. And as much as we might like to play those femdom games, neither my wife. As the full and exclusive owner of the mass of chemicals and electrical pulses that compose my body, it is I and only I who has the ethical right to decide what goes into my body, what comes out of my body. And when it is time for me to shed this corporeal cage, which will have outlasted its usefulness by then, at least by my assessment, it is I, as the owner of my body, who will be the one to decide. Not you, not some ruler, not some joker on the internet, not some democratic mob. I and I alone. Now, I understand that this is an emotional issue for all of us. Every one of us will die. And everyone has family and friends who will at some point die. Well, except for Jeff and JJ, they have some sort of plot to live forever, and they may be clever enough to pull it off. But I grant that it is a sense of helplessness that we feel when we watch our loved ones deteriorate And this may cause us to violate their wish to shorten their suffering. Frankly, it will be unlikely to be their wish. Death is such a scary process, and we have such deep religious and cultural taboos against it. But it could be their wish, and the fear that may prevent you from doing what you know is the right thing, which is voting in the affirmative tonight, is that by so voting you might be shortening your own enjoyment of their life, or at least your imagination of their enjoyment. Because I can tell you, if she's ready for suicide, she will not be enjoying what you think you'll be enjoying. And so some of you may vote negative to not give yourself nor your loved ones the legal opportunity to peacefully, in the arms of your loved ones, at the time when it makes most sense to you and your life. But there are consequences. First, you're committing an ethical sin. It's the most basic violation of another person's most precious human rights, their ownership of their own body. It's what defines us. It is an implication that your loved one does not really own her own body. That you, or maybe your ruler, owns her. That she's not equal to you or to them. That there are masters and she a slave. And thus she must suffer at the end of her life for what? For amusement, fantasy of eternal life, a false ego, fear, a power trip, or perhaps prove your courage to some keyboard warrior. To deny us what we want, you may be condemning us to a desperate death. I asked one Liberty representative why he had voted against assisted suicide. And he scoffed, "What do you need help for? You have a sawed-off shotgun underneath your bed, and when the time comes, you just blow off your head." Is that really what you and your loved one want to mess with at the end of your life? Is that really what your loved one or you, the mess that you want to walk into? Few of us will have that shotgun under the bed, and so you'll have to watch your loved one toss in pain and misery. You might beg the nurse, they're too understaffed to really care, for more chemicals to ease her pain, only to hear, "Well, you know there's an opioid crisis, and we can't be too careful." If you really are going to deny the wishes of the person who's ready to die, are you prepared for the purgatory of watching her die? Expiating your sin of arrogance for violating her self-ownership, for not allowing her the human respect to let her select her end of life under the conditions that she wanted it. Or perhaps you may be unable to take the screaming and the misery that I had with my mother. And so you're going to be faced with committing legal murder. You imagine maybe that you'll have a wink and a nod, some kind country doctor or nurse or hospice worker. But what if your healthcare worker is the cruel Mrs. Ratchet? Then you're going to have a very dangerous decision to make with your life. And one that may change your life forever with the criminal justice system. Or worse, you might try something desperate that doesn't even work, leaving her in an even worse state. Every one of us will die. Every one of us will have loved ones who die. The question we have to answer is whether we will then allow them the respect to die in the way that they choose, or will we demand that they submit to dying the way that we command, or the way our rulers command? This debate tonight is not really about your personal preferences for how you might want to end your life. It's not whether I or some guy behind a keyboard will judge you for displaying courageousness or selfishness. It's not whether you would choose to personally assist or perhaps to withhold your assistance. It's not whether you would support her decision or whether you would argue that it's too early to die right now. That pain and debilitation that you're feeling, it's really not too much. Just hang on a little bit more. This debate is worded as should, and thus we are talking about ethics. We are talking about who has the ethical right to decide for my body. Is it I, the person living inside my body? That I may have grown so weary of that I have decided it's time to leave it? Or is it my neighbor? Or some guy on the internet? Do they get to vote to override my self-ownership? Let's get real here, folks. It won't be you, nor some voters, nor the masses who will enslave our bodies to conform to their preferences. It will be some psychopathic politician, some demagogue using our death pains to rile the masses for his political advancement. It will be some bureaucratic functionary overlord with his checkboxes and his forms in triplicate and his cover-your-ass regulations. They will decide whether I, as their effective slave, trapped in a body that I no longer want to inhabit, may obtain their permission to remove myself from their service. You can call me stupid, you can call me pressured, you can call me selfish, you can call me a coward, but it's my body. And I am the only one who has the ethical right to end my life in the manner that I choose at the time that I choose with the associations whom I choose. Anything else would be a violation of me as a free and sovereign human being. This debate, I want to note, is circumscribed. We have explicitly removed the fringe cases. We are assuming here rational, aware actors making their own decisions. What we are talking about here is most people. That is, we're talking about you and we're talking about me. We're talking about whether it is you who gets to decide for your body and whether it is I who decide for my body. Do we have that fundamental human right? Or do you truly believe that our rulers have the right to enslave our bodies for their preferences, their plans, and their profits? Because once we give them that, we have lost everything. I yield my time.
Dexter has 15 minutes.
Well, thank you. So, when I first appeared in this forum, I knew then that my cause in defending the more conservative position on welfare reform was a daunting challenge. And ultimately, it was unlikely that I could persuade the majority of the House to slow that process down. But that debate was, nonetheless, a spirited, at least academic exercise, in which I hope did something to advance serious thinking on the subject of our discussion, despite the probable hopelessness of my argument that I made there. Now, likewise, I do also accept that in rising in opposition to this evening's resolution, my purpose is also likely doomed. Not, I would hasten to add, so doomed as I suspect that many people should shortly be if Mr. Pratt's manifesto, however, were adopted. Now, I find that the arguments, contrary to the resolution, broadly consist of two strains, and I'll elaborate on those this evening. But in pursuing them both, I want to tell you that I've made a personal commitment in this argument to eschew making any positive assertions of theism. And thereby it's my hope that we can avoid an argument which obviously can never be resolved absent perhaps a supernatural intervention in tonight's proceedings, which I promise you I've not been praying for. As having said that, I do hope you'll just indulge me a brief disclaimer along those lines. I am an Orthodox Christian, and as such I do believe, to a certainty, that the source of life comes from other than ourselves, and indeed from beyond nature. Now I personally consider that we are the recipients, and the fiduciary custodians of life, morally bound to uphold it until its natural termination. Now, I can understand the potential concern held by some here who, being aware of my religious persuasion at the outset, are going to anticipate that the remainder of my argument will consist of equivocation, that I'm just going to attempt to clothe spiritual reasoning as worldly logic. So to those so concerned, I'll tell you that you can rest assured that while my purely rational positions in this case, well, it's pretty much equally monolithic to a religion, I'm not going to be attempting any spiritual conversions this evening. The arguments against suicide on both strains will consist only of human logic. But since we have at least caressed here the idea of a moral connection to the question of suicide, let me now assert the first strain of my argument, and that is that all suicide is a moral wrong. The clear moral boundary here as it relates to this question can be illustrated in the distinction, for example, between the removal of life support measures and assisted suicide. Now, in the former case, the proximate cause of death was whatever misfortune rendered the patient in need of life support, and the removal of such aid ceases only to delay or to suspend the inevitable result of that earlier event. But in the latter case, the intention is not to permit death, but to cause it. And this is where I identify the moral wrong. And you don't need to view morality as transcendent, or indeed even through the lens of some natural law, in order to satisfy yourself of its existence. In order to satisfy yourself of existence, you need only consider that, as Dr. Daniel Solmassi wrote in his treatise on this subject, and I'll quote, "The very idea of interpersonal ethics depends upon our mutual recognition of each other's equal, independent worth, the value we have simply because we are human. The very idea of interpersonal ethics depends on the value that we acknowledge we have simply by nature of the fact that we possess human life." Now, that utilitarian argument, which is offered here by Mr. Pratt, that an individual's interests can supersede the incalculable value of his own existence, portrays what is a rather novel and I think solipsistic picture of humanity. It's rather radical. The idea that a person's individual interests can outweigh the universally equal intrinsic value of human life, a thing that is necessary to the most basic interpersonal communion. This idea represents a flawed understanding of the world. For example, if one were to follow the logic in this argument to its extreme conclusion, and the value of total autonomy were superordinate to that of life itself, a person with no perceptible autonomous interests, for instance, an infant, or in the case of someone with a profound mental disability, this person could inescapably be judged to possess less of a right to life, having no autonomous interest. And this is, of course, an unacceptable position. Just as wrong as it would be to assess an individual's productive capacity or their potential as being of greater worth than their life itself. To rank any interest or any quality above the intrinsic value of life makes for a deeply unsteady philosophy of existence. Therefore, one needn't embrace any spirituality, whatever, to concede that society does possess an appreciable moral concern in preventing such wrongs as are offensive to life, which concern must necessarily go beyond the mere interest of the individual. And while there is surely a shared enthusiasm between Mr. Pratt and myself for limiting the scope of the state's power, it is one thing to reject the interference of government in, say, setting the price of wages, but quite another to reject its interest in preventing the practice of gross moral evils. Well, the other strain of the argument against suicide is, in my judgment, secondary to that of the first. Those who remain unconvinced by even a secular view of morality, as I've just laid out, must embrace this argument to some extent. Now, I suspect that Mr. Pratt and this resolution does not affirm that the state should actively administer the suicide regime it envisions. On that we can agree, at least rhetorically. But it does leave us to wonder what the private death industry will look like under the resolution. For surely, I think any reasonable person can foresee that a whole pack of devious commercial providers will very shortly begin to engage in unnecessary or low-quality death procedures, either because of resource limitations or through the more sinister motivation of profit. Indeed, if you examine the highest ranked explanations for requesting assisted suicide as reported in Oregon, where the practice is legal, loss of autonomy, decreased ability to participate, and loss of dignity rank first, while incontinence becoming burdensome to others and financial costs all ranked last. Curious then that here the purported desires of the patients seem diametrically opposite to the interests we would expect of the death care providers. While in this all-important decision, the would-be patients prioritize clearly the intangible, but the providers will inevitably be consumed with those matters which weigh least heavily to their often helpless patients. For example, mounting expenses, burdensome behavior, and incontinence. The profit motivation of the unregulated death industry will run directly counter to the expressed motivations of those whom they purport to serve. And this concern is not merely academic. It's borne out in the lived experience of the world. The Dutch ceased to prosecute cases of physician-assisted suicide in the 1980s. And by the time of the government-commissioned Remelink report in 1991, over 50% of assisted death cases were involuntary. When a more comprehensive policy was passed in 2004, again in the Netherlands, Wesley Smith, then writing for the Weekly Standard, ascertained that a full 21% of infant euthanasia cases in the Netherlands were conducted without the request or the consent of the parents. In the intervening time since then, jurisdictions like the Netherlands, Belgium, and our own state of Oregon have progressed even further in their pursuit of this insanity, finding increasingly foolish and broad criteria for the elimination of a life. How do we counter the grave risk that's presented here? Do we intervene with regulation? Well, show me the person who believes that if we should allow that, the state would not promptly arrogate to itself an ultimately devastating extrajudicial power over life and death, and I will show you a fool. It is in the nature of companies to pursue gains. It is in the nature of states to acquire power. I think it's naive for us to imagine that either party would leave anything on the table under the resolution. So therefore I assert that there is a great practical concern here which remains unaddressed by the arguments in favor of the resolution. Now finally, while I don't count this as central to the negative argument, before I do conclude, I want to make some mention of the role of palliative and therapeutic care in the debate. Now, as I've mentioned, there is a clear moral distinction between the termination of artificial life support measures and suicide or euthanasia. Likewise, there can be no serious moral or philosophical objections to the use of either palliative care or therapeutic treatment, for example, for mental health disorders, unless I suppose there's some type of stoic. These avenues are both widely effective and widely available. And while this argument reflects no fundamental moral truth, these are things that are the fruits of human ingenuity, it does rather precisely attack the contention that intractable pain, or what some would wrongly call the preservation of dignity, that these are reasonably addressed by affecting the untimely death of the patient, is clearly attacked by the availability of these means. And while we can find hope in the continued advancement of medical science along these lines, we surely ought not to co-opt the medical profession into the promotion of a moral wrong, nor the state, nor society at large. Human life is the fountainhead of all other freedoms. If you are unwilling to embrace such practices as would destroy the inestimably precious source of life. I urge you to reject the resolution. Thank you, Mr. Pratt. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, Dennis, 7 minutes to go.
Okay, thank you. Well, Dexter has correctly rested this argument where it belongs, which is on ethics. He calls it morals. I make a distinction between the minimum regard that we have to have for each and every person, ethics, the respect for the self-ownership of every person, that if we reject that, that person then becomes our slave. If we reject self-ownership, who are we to actually reject it? There is a performative contradiction when we reject self-ownership. On that, once you give me self-ownership, you have all of libertarianism. And it is because of self-ownership that we must support each person's decision about their own body. Because otherwise, it's going to be someone else. Now, Dexter has proposed a moral theory. He doesn't explain on what it rests. He says there's a universal respect for life, for human life. Well, respect, value, these types of things, these words he uses, those are subjective decisions. There is no value absent the person making the assessment. A rock could either be something extraordinarily valuable or a total waste to different types of people. That is one of the key precepts of our whole economic system, that we value different things. He comes from a religious background. He believes that there is a universal valuation, which is very similar to him and to his church. And they value life as an absolute, regardless of whether you want it or not. They value it. And I have no problem with him valuing it. As a matter of fact, if he and his church wanted to set up enormous roadblocks to prevent themselves from being able to end their lives, you could contractually do that. I have no objection to that whatsoever. My objection is them taking their value and foisting it on the rest of us. Especially somebody who disagrees. Who says, no, my life is worth something to me. You know, I'm not too sure how much worth it is to Dexter. He never saw me again. You know, what's it to him? I'm the one who has to live it. Why is he making a decision about the value of my life to me? How does he get to do that? How does that happen? I mean, you know, is he somebody who actually owns me? Because that's what he would have to be doing to say that. So, I reject his moral framework. I don't believe there is a universal value for life, just as there is not a universal value for sticking a knife into someone. If we consent, we go to a surgeon, and they cut things out of us because we consented. Why? Because we own our body. And we said, yeah, you know, usually, hey, we don't want knives stuck in us. In this case, stick a knife in me. I give my consent. It's my body. So for me to posit, oh, there's a universal rejection of tearing people's bodies apart. No, there isn't. It is a subjective matter to the person who owns that body. And nobody owns you except you. Let's see. He talks a little bit about the sinister private market. Is there a more sinister organization in the world than government? Government rests on the fallacy that they own our bodies. They can take our bodies and throw them into wars. They can take our bodies and have us labor for them. They can have us labor for them proactively, and they can have us labor for them retroactively by stealing the product of our labor after we have produced it. They can tell us what we can do, and now they're even telling us what we can inject into our own bodies or not. Now they could positively say, oh, there's a universal value to health. Fuck them. This is my body. And when we give to the most evil, the most sinister organization in the world the right to take over our body, to control our body, to use our body for whatever it is they want, to tell us when we can have an operation, when we can't have an operation, what we must inject, what we must consume, what we can't consume. They are taking us as slaves. We are not slaves to rulers. A private company, they can't do that to us. They can make an offer, they can have a nice brochure, to show pictures of us on clouds in some great heaven, and maybe I believe that, maybe I don't believe it. And I'm like, oh, come on, that seems ridiculous. But it doesn't matter because it's my decision. It will be my decision. When we give up our self-ownership to the government, it becomes their decision, and every great evil comes from that confusion that we do not own ourselves, that our rulers own ourselves. This is a crux position. Do we own our bodies? And we cannot give that to our rulers.
Dexter, 7 minutes to rebut.
Thank you. I find a curious contradiction in some of what Dennis just said. Without, for instance, a universal respect for the existence of life, I find it hard to imagine how anything can be judged right or wrong. It seems to me, though in his opening argument he referenced the supreme ethical sin that is confronted by the question of suicide, he eschews that now and seems to be saying that in fact the only right or wrong is simply governed by its proximity to allowing people to do whatever they want. I use the phrase interest when I discussed it in my argument, and essentially does not defeat the argument that I made in the beginning, that interest does not overcome life. I find it hard to imagine how, if there is no respect for life that is the gauge of right or wrong, but only freedom of choice, how a great number of other things could be judged universally, morally right or wrong. How is murder judged right or wrong based only on an individual's autonomy or self-interest? And I find it interesting also that in the rebuttal, there was a lot of reference to the government and private industry. I referenced both of them as being potentially seriously mishandling the implementation of a legalized suicide system. It's both of them that are risky for the reasons that I laid out. And so while there was a lot of great rhetoric discussing the evils of government and the joys of freedom, I didn't once hear a positive argument that overcame any of the practical concerns which I laid out. And I see, in fact, there were holes that he brought up himself that go directly towards the practical concerns that I laid out. Dennis suggested that he wanted a peaceful, painless, non-messy, and guaranteed end. Well, through palliative care, a peaceful, painless, non-messy, and guaranteed end can be provided. In conclusion, I'll just respond to the fact that Dennis questioned whether or not he was a coward. I don't think Dennis is at all a coward. I simply think that he is wrong. like to go first, or should I?
Why don't you go first?
Sure. Well, why don't we follow then directly on the question that I raised in rebuttal? Is it your contention that there is no right or wrong based on respect for human life, but only based on the freedom of choice?
I don't know how I could be clearer. There's no right or wrong except for self-ownership. There's no universal anything. So, except that we have to respect each and every other person's self-ownership. So, is it right or wrong for you to punch me in the nose? There's no universal there. There's no universal. If we agree to a fisticuffs, right? You may punch me in the nose. If I keep my guard down, that is just part and parcel. It's, is it right or wrong to stick a knife in me? If you're a surgeon and I desperately need some, I may give you that consent. The right and wrong is self-ownership. That is the minimum basis that we must treat each person with respect. And that's it. There's nothing else. Now, there's a lot of things that come off of that. A lot of things that come off of it. One of the infinite number of things that come off of that is respect for someone's right to end their life, to end their existence with that body, because we have to respect them. Now, if you're going to deny that we respect the self-ownership, that we have some sort of superior, as a matter of fact, I'll go ahead. I'll ask my question. Will you? What a segue. What a segue.
Beautiful.
So, by what right does someone say, you may not kill yourself? As a matter of fact, I may actually harm you to stop you from killing yourself. I may beat you. I may cage you. I may hurt you financially. I may actually require that you stay in an institution that pays me lots of good campaign contributions, and run through all of your savings. By what right would I have that to do to you when you felt, no, I'm done. Leave me be. Leave me be. Right? So where do you inject yourself, Dexter, in this?
Well, since I now understand that there is no right or wrong besides self-interest, essentially, self-ownership. Yeah, but that's essentially the same thing, isn't it? Well, let me ask it that way. What is the difference between self-ownership and one's interest to do whatever one wants with their free autonomy? Well, if one can do anything, I wonder, actually, it kind of leads me to the question that I want to ask in follow-up to this, but let me answer yours first, which was again, what gives me the right, or gives, in my view, society the right to impose these rules? Well, again, in my conception of it, which I think to be, again, it's you brought up religion, but I've completely divorced this from the theistic argument. I accept that life is the fundamental gauge against which morality, in this case, can be judged. For instance, I can abridge your liberty for a period of time, and then I could return it to you at a time later, and you would have it back. You know, it's like the argument how you can't get unvaccinated when you leave work at the end of the day. I can return that to you when I abridge it. I can't give you your life back if I abridge that. It is the fundamental currency of human interaction and existence. It is necessary to society that the respect that people have for each other comes not from their own willingness to see the other person do whatever they want, but the respect for the life itself that exists in them. And that is why I conceive that society does have a vested interest in preventing things which, by my standard that I've presented, are morally wrong. And that's the argument that I stand on. Society has an interest when a moral evil is being committed. And because this is a question of life, I think we can definitively say, without religion, that a moral evil is occurring when assisted suicide takes place.
Does anybody have questions for Dennis? I'll take moderator's prerogative. Dennis, there's sometimes when people go through a hard time in their life and they suffer from depression, which is a chemical imbalance in their brain, and sometimes their brain just isn't thinking very well, and sometimes their brain just is not making decisions that it would make if it was in good balance. How would you give the same type of rights to those people that maybe are younger, maybe they'll recover, just because it's like a bad situation in their life?
Thank you. The question has to do, and I'm just answering this for the recording. The question has to do with what do we do with a chemical imbalance where someone is really upset and depressed, and do they have the same right to their self-ownership as any other person who is not clinically depressed? Is that correct?
Yeah, somebody that's like clinically that's depressed and could likely recover.
Right. So let me first say, that's outside of the debate limits. We specifically rejected fringe, and it's not to say that these aren't important questions, right? They're important questions. It's just we could have a whole other debate on the fringes, and we bring up different fringes to go with each other. But the question denies self-ownership in its entire formation, right? The question assumes that we can make the decision for this person. Whose life is it? Whose business is it? It's hers. So to actually say, well, will we allow this to happen? Will I allow this to happen? Who am I to take her decision away from her? So self-ownership is, I believe, an absolute right. It's an absolute right if you're deemed by a doctor or by a politician to not be thinking right. There are a lot of people, if you've noticed, who aren't thinking right nowadays. They seem to be deplorable, they seem to be stupid, they seem to have some sort of mental defect. And I think we could certainly have the doctors who all follow science certify that they are temporarily out of their minds, and therefore our rulers have every right to control them. I reject that. The next point I want to make is that the solution to an exception is not to enslave everyone. So whatever solution we come up with here is not, the solution can't be, okay, so we're going to enslave 95% of the people, because I can imagine somebody doing something bad, doing something wrong. No, we have to respect everyone's self-ownership, even if it means that someone's going to use drugs poorly, even if it means that someone's going to be a prostitute, even if you go right down the line of all the laws that are happening here, it's because we've turned this around. We have turned this around such that if I can imagine somebody doing something, the answer is enslavement of everyone. That's what the vax mandates are about. Right? I'm going to enslave everybody because I'm imagining something. It turns out to be total bullshit. I'm going to imagine something. Oh my God, now I get to enslave everybody. No. Self-ownership is absolute. Now, if I come across somebody who's on the edge of a cliff, and this is where ethics and morals diverge. If I come across someone who's on the edge of a cliff, and I'm not convinced that she really is making a decision, I may actually violate her ethics. I may violate her. And I may violate her for a moral reason. This is why I use those two terms differently. Ethically, she has every right to her body, even if she's wrong, even if she's confused. Ethically, she has every right to her body. And morally, I can't sleep at night if I don't take steps. So I might stop her. I may actually restrain her. I may even punch her in the nose. But let me be clear, I have violated her. I have abrogated her self-ownership. I have committed an ethical sin. And she has a right to sue me. She has a right for some sort of corrective action. Now, I'm taking this chance because I think, oh, this is going to be temporary. Right? This is going to be temporary. Oh, my God. Well, let's say that I take her back, it's temporary. She goes, oh, thank you so much. You know, her nose is a little bit crooked or something like that. But she goes, thank you so much for punching me in the nose. I really, oh my God, I'm so relieved. Oh my God, I'm going to have a great life. And we laugh about it and we go on. Or she gets really pissed off and she sues me. And now I have to go in front of a court. And I say, hey, she was about to jump off. And you guys go, yeah, you're guilty. You owe her $1. You know? Or she says, no, what the heck are you guys talking about? This is my life, and I am choosing to do this. Now, I actually owe her. I owe her because I have violated her. And so maybe what I have to do is I have to actually go up there and stand guard for her the next time, so that some other white knight doesn't come and stop her. Because she's going through her process. She owns her life. Will there be bad things that happen? There are bad things happening now. There are bad things happening on both sides here. Can I imagine something bad happening? I can imagine something bad happening. Those outside this thing. The question here is rational, reasonable people. Can we make our decision for our own life? But on the fringes, I still say that we must respect self-ownership. We must respect every single human being.
Do we have any questions for Dexter?
I have a question for Dexter. I just want to like you to clarify society's claim on the person. As I understood the way you explained it, that claim is simply to prevent some sort of immoral act from happening. Is that true, or do you see an additional claim?
Exactly. I would say that society, as I said, has an interest in preventing something that we can determine is morally wrong. And based on the arguments about the value of life, I think we can determine that in the case of suicide. So, yeah, so it's the basis of society's right to prevent that. And of course, as to the necessity of society and having those sort of social covenants, I think it's pretty clear. I'm a pretty big hermit by and large, but I don't have a farm, and I need to eat. An even more universal example, in that it took a not uncomplex interaction between two people to make you and me and everyone in the world. Society exists fundamentally at the most basic levels. So while society exists, certainly it's incumbent on them to prevent things that are universally wrong.
Could I just follow up on it? So, is it possible for an action by a person to be immoral if it affects no one else?
Yeah, I think it is. A good example of that, I would say, is that you can't sell yourself into slavery under the law. That's a law that's made to prevent a moral evil that only affects the individual, which I think is just.
I have a question for Dexter. All right.
Well, wait, it's my turn.
Yeah, does anybody have a question for Dennis right now? Well,
Can I ask a question for both of them at once?
yeah.
Have either of you guys ever suffered from suicidal ideation past? Does that matter at all today? That's outside the scope of this,
Maybe you can say hypothetically, would that affect your stance?
Say it probably.
Would you like to answer that?
Sure. I'll
Repeat the question. Is
Yeah.
that question I asked?
So the question was whether either Dennis or I have ever experienced suicidal ideation. I think it was a kind of clarifying. Would it hypothetically, if we did at least, affect our calculus? Sure.
I just want to before the answer, because suicide is the thing that people can imagine. Death is something that people can imagine all the time. Talking about like it's a sincere, something that you know, should be considered not just imagining. You know, because you hear about someone thinking about suicide in the news, and of course, you know, those think about pink elephants, right? So I'm talking about more on like a serious consideration.
So you seriously consider it?
Yeah, consider suicide.
Yeah. Well, you know, I will plead the fifth on that one. But I would certainly say to the tail end of the question that was added, yes, whatever my answer is, it certainly would affect my calculus on this, though ultimately I think my conclusion would have to be the same either way, because for me, it's a fundamental, universal truth.
So the answer is yes, of course, because I opened up my argument by saying that I fully intend to end my own life. I hope to end my own life. Unless, of course, it's accidental, but yes, I intend to end my own life under my own conditions. But, you know, even more importantly, I think when I was younger, when I was a child and certainly in my teen years, you know, I lived in a home that had a lot of abuse. And, you know, I actually made decisions consciously. I will continue living today. So for me, the decision isn't something that's strange or different. It's something that is a reasonable question to ask. Is it worthwhile to continue on? Now, I'm sorry.
I'm ready.
So, let's say my mother is a sound mind, provides failing. She is not in imminent risk of death, but she has a poor quality of life in her estimation. She's gone into a nursing home and is spending, you know, thousands of dollars, isn't happy, is miserable, is maybe even in pain, but there's no imminent, you know, this could go on.
Sure.
She wants to end her life and she wants me to help her. Do you believe that if I helped her, I should be thrown in prison?
Well, it's an interesting question. I didn't foresee it ending that way. It's quite interesting because I don't think that I have spent a very long amount of time dwelling on how the law necessarily should be enforced. I know, aside from the basics, that obviously we can't enforce it against people who successfully kill themselves. And so, well, I don't, sure, yeah. Well, about with what penalty is my question. So, death for everyone who helps.
If they
Yeah.
come to me and they try to find me, and I refuse to
Sure.
pay, they can try to arrest me, if I refuse to be arrested and resist.
Sure. It could escalate to death. So to answer your question as to whether or not you should be thrown in jail, I don't know what the appropriate punishment is, but in my conception of the way that the law should be implemented, yes, it should be illegal for someone to assist another person in suicide. So again, I don't want to say throw you in jail, kill you, any of these things. I certainly wouldn't presume to determine that. What should it be? I don't know if I'm the appropriate person to come up with what the right penalty is.
So you just let the government figure that out?
Well, I think society, generally the function of society.
Society doesn't think, it's a person.
Yes, but if we don't have, you say, well, okay, I can imagine in the libertarian conception, I guess, in this, where are we imagining a world where there isn't a government? Because I'm thinking of this in terms of the practical reality of today when I talk about legalization, as opposed to a theoretical reality in which government's role is diminished.
The legislature decides the penalty and delegates that to the.
Well, the judiciary branch was given appropriate discretion. I don't know. Again, the dynamics specifically of how the law should be implemented. But to the general question, should there be a penalty for committing a grave moral crime? Yes, I think that there should be.
Do you have a question for Dennis? Do you want to answer?
No, just go ahead and conclude. If there's no further questions.
Any more questions for either Dennis or Dexter?
Okay. Actually, I have, since we're here, I actually want to pitch this to you guys. So, my grandfather passed away in 2011. He was elderly. He had Alzheimer's. He had a heart attack on a Monday, and he didn't die until that Friday, within the heart attack. He spent 5 days unconscious, lots of brain activity. There was a huge debate in my family where I had one uncle who wanted to try and keep my grandfather alive as possible in the hope that he might have woken up, could have been a vegetable. I mean, well, who knows, right? And then there was on my mother's side of it, they're like, it's like, this is, whereas the situation was too bad, it is actually not, it was benefit to the quality of life of his own and to the life of my grandmother that did pass away at that time.
Can you maybe give us a synopsis?
I don't think I think in that I guess
Pop it up to a higher level. What's the crux of your question?
Are we talking about withdrawing life support, right?
In this debate within my family, my mother and her brothers, who might have been more correct? Obviously, my grandfather passed away, right? What was it?
So I'll go ahead and answer. From my perspective, the question is all around consent. And it sounds like your grandfather didn't actually consent to one person having a decision over another. I would be more than happy to have somebody make a decision for me, but I'd have to have a talk to them. And we have these ideas now of living wills where there would be somebody who makes that decision if I cannot make that decision, right? So if I actually voluntarily say, under these conditions, this person will make this decision, or this person will give me this type of injection, that's what I'm talking about. Do you have anything else about when it's an unknown who amongst the family should decide?
Yeah, it's a tough question, especially if we're considering, which I think is true in this scenario, that there was no living will or any directives, right? So we don't know what his desires were.
So the person I think who was in charge of this was my grandmother at the time.
Yeah.
No, I thought it was relevant to the debate that we're having today because I was like, wow, I'd like to hear what they have to say about that. So.
Yeah, I'd say probably Dennis and I actually come as close to agreeing on this as we do about any of the other topics that we did. So yeah, this was the one that brought us together because now I do think his wishes in that case should hold out if they're known to us, and otherwise it is a difficult question to answer. Because as I said before, that line of where the moral wrong happens, I don't believe is crossed when life support is withdrawn and nature's allowed to take its course. So for me, it's not a moral right line as to who was right there, who was wrong.
Well, thank you guys.
So conclusion?
Yes.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay. I started out talking tonight about how I was discovered to be a selfish coward. But I ask you to put aside your harsh judgments of my lack of virtue and focus instead on human ethics. I explained how the negation of this resolution assumes that we are all slaves to our rulers. The type of slavery that has plagued mankind for so many millennia. It allows rulers to believe that they own our bodies and that they may dispose of us however they choose. Most of the truly diabolical evil this world has suffered has stemmed from that one single unethical belief. And here tonight you have in front of you a stark, ultimate test of who owns you. It's in an emotional area, but this is where the rubber meets the road. Is it you, or is it your political master, perhaps in consultation with Dexter? Because if it's you, all they can do ethically is argue and discuss and debate and maybe send you a glossy pamphlet in the mail. They may not ethically use violence against you, nor against your spouse, nor against your friend, nor against your hire. But if it is they who own you, then they have every single right to tell you if, when, and how you should die. You see, your body wouldn't belong to you. It's theirs. Your ending of your body would be a theft of their property interest in you. No wonder authoritarians think that libertarians are so selfish. We're stealing something that's theirs. Our own bodies. And of course, anyone who conspires with me to steal my body from its rightful owners should pay a price, a steep price. Not so much to pay them back for the use of this junky body that I don't even want, but to prove to any other slave who might get it into his head that he owns himself and not his master. And so I invite you to reflect on this one decision point here, as emotional as it may be. Whose body is yours ultimately? But I don't want to leave you with just the ethical case. Nor do I want to leave you with the horrors of what might have happened if you were to deny someone their right to make a decision for their own life. I'm a dog lover. I've had 16 dogs. And when our dogs are ready to die, they stop eating, they stop pooping, and they tell us. And we know, our family gathers around, the vet comes to our house. That's how we actually choose our vet, whether they will help us with a humane death for our animal. We hold our dogs in our arms. We kiss them. We stroke them. We tell them how much we love them. The vet adds the chemicals to the already started IV, and our dog goes off to sleep and stops breathing, and the heartbeat stops beating. And we stay with him for a long while, stroking and comforting him for his life well lived and for his peaceful death. I want to go to a boutique that specializes in a similar service, but for humans, beautifully appointed. It offers counseling. It helps to write my story. And when I'm ready to host a party, a pre-wake, if you will, with my loved ones and friends, and we reminisce, view photos and videos, and hear testimonies. And when the time comes, that is when I say my time has come. And I'm ready because I've said the last things I've wanted to say to each loved one. I and a core group go into an interior room, a finer room, one playing music that has soothed me since I was young. It has pictures and a guided meditation that I've pre-selected. And I rest my head amongst my inner circle, and I say goodbye, and I go to sleep peacefully, painlessly, without mess, with no side effects, embraced, loved, appreciated by those whom I love. And that would be the death that I would choose. Absent some assured service like this, well, I guess I'd like to keep an injection next to my bed just to make sure that I will be the one to have that choice. But frankly, I may have to go early. Because what if I lose the capability to make that decision? I don't want to put my wife in a position where she has to make a decision knowing what my preferences are to risk her life. If I could, I'd sign a document here and now for you all to witness that my wife may kill me at any time of her choosing and not face any criminal charges. If I could, but I may not.
It's on the record now.
So if you force me with a vote tonight, I may just have to keep that ugly sawed-off shotgun underneath my bed and go way earlier than I would otherwise. Because I don't want to die the helpless victim of the non-existent mercy of tyrants.
Well, thank you once again for allowing me to have the chance to argue the conservative position on a controversy, for sure, which has a very expansive and truly essential impact on society. And so whatever the House might conclude this evening, I do hope that you've enjoyed the discussion, the very light discussion, as much as I have. Now, just briefly to summarize my argument against the resolution. Mr. Pratt is facially confronted with the dual truths that prove that his assertions are incorrect. First, that suicide, either direct or assisted, is a moral wrong in that it destroys the infinitely priceless life of the individual. We are not talking here about the ownership of the body, as we keep hearing, but of the existence of the life and the value which is intrinsic to it. Second, to everyone, which is precisely my point. Now, secondly, that due to the innumerable constant risks, no structure, public or private, is capable or appropriate for the implementation of a legalized suicide regime. And that's an argument which, frankly, I have not yet heard countered. A society which accepts these assisted deaths debases that very quality of personhood which gives human liberty its meaning. And we all must suffer many times in our lives. But our state of suffering must not ever be seen to degrade the fundamental value of our lives, even into their final moments. So let's continue to learn the ways to mitigate our suffering and to mitigate the suffering of others. But let's do it without losing sight of the sublime importance of that which makes progress, social joy, and even liberty possible, and that is life itself. Therefore, I'll ask you to join me in voting against the resolution. Once again, thank you, Mr. Pratt. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Wow.
So, 29%. So undecided was 29%. I think you did that. So 57% yes, 14% no, 29% undecided. The second vote, the one yes improved by 28%. No improved by 0%. So Dennis Pratt's the winner.